What you're seeing on the screen is the beginning of the presentation, which is going to be about the political fight to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And if any of you think that we have political troubles now, cast your mind back 100 years and listen to Dennis Cross as he tells us the story of one of the most bitter political battles of the 20th century. It cost the treaty itself, it cost the life of the president, and it left bitterness in the political arena that lasted for years. In fact, as anyone will note from reading about Princeton's recently cleaning out President Wilson's legacy, some of that bitterness may even last today. And the political fight may well have contributed to the start of World War II. So, with that introduction, Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. That was an excellent introduction into this story, which is a fascinating story. The prelude to the story was the last presentation I gave to the volunteers, which was done in person. This is going to be the first time we've done it by a Zoom conference. As you recall, those of you who were at the last presentation, the Paris Peace Conference took place from January to June of 1919. The negotiations were exclusively among the victorious allies, and the final draft of the treaty with Germany wasn't shown to Germany, and their input wasn't even requested until May 4th, when the treaty was actually, it was presented, it was sent to the printer on May 4th and presented to the Germans on May 7th. Germany submitted a lengthy reply on May 29th, objecting to the proposed treaty on a number of grounds, including that it was contrary to President Wilson's 14 points, on the basis of which Germany had agreed to an armistice. And indeed, it was hard to reconcile with the 14 points, as we'll see. On June 16th, after 2 weeks of uncertainty and controversy about how to respond to the German objections, the Allies decided to leave the treaty substantially unchanged and gave the Germans a 3-day deadline to take it or leave it. The German foreign minister advised his government not to sign. But on June 23rd, after an extension of the deadline, the National Assembly in Weimar passed a resolution agreeing to the treaty as written. The treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on June 28th, coincidentally the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Germany was represented by its new foreign minister, Hermann Müller. President Wilson left Paris immediately after the signing and boarded the USS George Washington in Brest for his return voyage to the United States, where he faced a hostile Congress, both houses of which were now controlled by the Republicans. Wilson knew his work was cut out for him. At the very end of the old Congress in March of 1919, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the incoming chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the outgoing leader of the minority of the old Congress, had submitted a round robin, so-called, which expressed opposition to the treaty as it then stood and was signed by enough of the incoming senators to defeat it if it came to a vote. The president arrived back in the United States on July 8th. The George Washington was met at sea by a flotilla of battleships. That's the George Washington there in the slide. Met by a flotilla of battleships, destroyers, submarine chasers, airplanes, and a dirigible. The flotilla was led by the super dreadnought USS Pennsylvania, carrying members of the cabinet and Congress. It landed at Hoboken, New Jersey, and he disembarked and passed between lines of cheering school children to a special ferry boat that took him across the Hudson to West 23rd Street. His motorcade proceeded through Manhattan, cheered along the way by hundreds of thousands of people. The motorcade ended at Carnegie Hall, where he went in and gave a speech. A band in Carnegie Hall struck up "Over There" and the Star Spangled Banner. The audience stood, cheered, blew police whistles. He spoke for 37 minutes, saying that he was glad to be home, and he joked that when his ship docked, he thought for the first time in his life that Hoboken was a beautiful city. He did not specifically mention the League of Nations in his talk, but he said he hoped that everyone, when they studied the treaty, would agree with him that it was a just peace. He took the midnight train to Washington, and on July 10th, for the first time in history, an American president appeared personally before the Senate to submit a treaty for ratification. President Wilson was greeted and escorted into the Senate chamber by Senator Lodge, accompanied by a bipartisan foursome. And there they are, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. In his speech, President Wilson told the Senate that the League of Nations, which was an integral part of the Treaty of Versailles, he had insisted on making it an integral part of the treaty, insisted that the League of Nations was the hope of mankind, and told the Senate that if the United States rejected the Treaty of Versailles, it would break the heart of the world. Former President William Howard Taft, he's the gentleman sitting in the middle of this group of distinguished gentlemen. He was a supporter of the League of Nations and the founder and president of the pro-ratification League to Enforce Peace. The group you see here are the leaders, the main people involved in the League to Enforce Peace, which had been organized a couple of years earlier and was now very much behind the Treaty of Versailles and the idea of the League of Nations. He proposed some reservations, as did other to the treaty, as did other prominent Republicans, including the 1916 presidential nominee Charles Evans Hughes, former Secretary of State Elihu Root, and Republican National Committee Chairman Will Hayes. A few days later, facing criticism from League supporters, Taft supported an LEP, a League to Enforce Peace resolution in support of unconditional ratification, but having earlier said that he would also agree to some reservations if necessary to get the treaty ratified. A mixed message had obviously been sent. In the Senate, debate on the treaty began with a speech on July 14th by Senator Claude Swanson in support of ratification, and President Wilson began holding meetings with Republican senators in an effort to persuade them to support the treaty. On the last day of the month, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee began public hearings. Meanwhile, what was happening in the country? Race riots broke out in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and a rapid increase in the cost of living led to labor unrest. And what else happened? On the 4th of July in Toledo, Ohio, Jess Willard, the great white hope who had defeated Jack Johnson to win the heavyweight boxing championship in 1915, lost his title to challenger Jack Dempsey when he failed to answer the bell for the 4th round. So we're going to be talking about a few other things besides just the Treaty of Versailles. On August 12th, in a speech on the Senate floor, Senator Lodge outlined 5 reservations that he considered essential to ratification of the treaty. Now, ratification, it means that the treaty would be ratified, but in the resolution ratifying the treaty, there would be these statements of things that the ratifying power, the United States, either understood the treaty to be or they reserved their rights in certain respects. And that was not unusual when treaties were submitted for ratification. Similar to the reservations that had been supported by Hughes and Charles Evans Hughes and Elihu Root, the reservations that Senator Lodge was advocating would provide that nothing in the League of Nations covenant would require the United States to send military forces into combat without the consent of Congress. Shortly afterward, at Lodge's request, President Wilson agreed to meet with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The meeting took place at the White House on August 19th, but no progress was made toward agreement. And the battle lines were hardened the next day when Senator Key Pittman, a Democrat who had been in the meeting, in an attempt to state the understandings that had been reached in the meeting. I said no progress was made toward agreement. Senator Pittman was took a more optimistic view, and as it turned out, a unrealistically optimistic view when he tried to outline mutual understandings that the parties had agreed to with the president. And others who were at the meeting, including a group that came to be known as the mild reservationists, in other words, those who wanted certain reservations in the treaty ratification, disavowed what he had said. And so as a result of this, Senator Pittman's attempt to state a common view backfired and actually resulted in the lines being hardened. The failure to arrive at a satisfactory compromise emboldened the irreconcilables who were opposed to League membership. And a few days later, on August 23rd, the Foreign Relations Committee voted in favor of an amendment to the treaty that would return Shantung to China. The treaty had, as you recall, again, if you remember what we talked about in the last presentation, the treaty that was finally agreed to, and much to the distress of President Wilson, but he finally did agree to it, was to give the Shantung province of China to Japan, basically, to let them occupy it. So the very first thing that the Foreign Relations Committee did was propose an amendment to the treaty, not a reservation, but an amendment, saying that Japan would have to return Shantung to China. The committee approved 3 more amendments, including one to equalize the votes of the United States and the British Empire in the General Assembly. The treaty had provided that the dominions of the British Empire were all going to have votes in the Assembly of the League of Nations. And one of the amendments that was now being proposed was that, well, no, we're not going to, the British Empire is only 1 vote. And the United States is not 48 votes, it's just 1 vote too. And because both of these proposals were unacceptable to President Wilson, because they were contrary to the treaty that he had drafted and brought home for ratification, he decided that the only solution was to embark on what was called in those days a swing around the circle, which means a cross-country speaking tour to the West Coast and back. I don't know that swing around the circle always went all the way to the West Coast, but it was a term that had been in use for some time. He planned speeches in 50 cities in 30 days in support of the treaty. On August 29th, Senator Philander Knox of Pennsylvania, an influential Republican who had served as Attorney General under Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt and as Secretary of State under President Taft, joined the ranks of the irreconcilables with a speech in which he condemned the treaty as not the treaty, but the truce of Versailles, which he said would, quote, kill the goose that we expect to lay the golden eggs. He advocated instead adoption of what came to be called the Knox Doctrine, which would simply pledge the United States to cooperate with other nations in the event of a threat to the peace of Europe. Also in August, an actors' strike closed plays on Broadway. If you saw the play George M. Cohan was very much opposed to the idea that actors could go on strike. But this was the beginning of actors' equity, which now basically is one of the more powerful parts of the Broadway scene. The war had broken out after the treaty, after the armistice, I should say, between Hungary and Romania, which ended in August 1919 in a Romanian victory when the Romanian army occupied Budapest and the communist dictator Bela Kun fled to the Soviet Union. On September 3rd, President Wilson departed on his cross-country speaking tour. His first stop was a luncheon address in Columbus, Ohio, the home of Republican Senator Warren G. Harding, future President Warren G. Harding, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a treaty opponent. Not one of the irreconcilables, but he was highly skeptical, let's put it that way. That evening, after Columbus, he went on to Indianapolis, Indiana, a state that was represented by 2 other Republican senators. His next stops were in St. Louis and Kansas City, reflecting the fact that one of Missouri's senators, James A. Reed, was the most outspoken Democratic Party opponent of the treaty. Speeches, sometimes 2 a day, followed in Des Moines, Omaha, Sioux Falls, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. As his train crossed Montana, Wilson learned of the September 12th testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee of William Bullitt, who had been a member of the American delegation to the peace conference, in which he revealed that Secretary of State Robert Lansing had shared many of his own concerns about the treaty and the League in a private conversation. Among other things, Lansing had called the League entirely useless and designed to serve the interest of England and France. In response to press inquiries, Lansing declined comment, but sent a telegram to Wilson that for some reason didn't reach him until several days later, by which time he had reached Los Angeles. In the telegram, Lansing called Bullitt's conduct and his blabbing about this private conversation a despicable and outrageous conduct, but what he did not do was deny that he had said it. This was the beginning of Lansing's downfall, which we'll get to later. Returning from the West Coast, President Wilson issued a statement in which he challenged the Senate to hold an up or down vote on the treaty without amendments or reservations. He got to Pueblo, Colorado. Here he's speaking in Pueblo, where on September 25th, he collapsed from what was described by his physician, Admiral Cary Grayson, as nervous exhaustion. His next stop was Wichita, Kansas, where he was scheduled to give another speech. By the time he got to Wichita, he had not recovered. He had gotten worse, if anything. And Admiral Grayson insisted that the rest of the speaking tour be canceled. And Wilson's wife was along with him, and between the two of them, Admiral Grayson and Edith Wilson, persuaded Wilson that he was in no condition to continue. So his train got underway and proceeded directly to Washington without stopping, although it went slowly so as not to, because the faster proceeding on the rails would have been very painful to the president. So on while the president was away on September 10th, the Foreign Relations Committee forwarded the Treaty of Versailles to the Senate with 38 proposed amendments and 4 reservations, along with hearing transcripts and a report signed by Senator Lodge on behalf of the Republican majority, which stated that the committee believes that the League as it stands will breed wars instead of securing peace. So the Republican majority of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came out very strongly against the treaty as it was written. One of the proposed amendments, called the Johnson Amendment after its author, Senator Hiram Johnson, would equalize the vote of the United States and the British Empire in the General Assembly. Other proposed amendments dealt with the Japanese occupation of Shantung, and others with the makeup of international commissions involving American interests. The next day, the committee's Democratic minority submitted its report arguing for ratification of the treaty without amendments or reservations. Also in September of 1919, General Pershing led the 1st Division in a victory parade on Fifth Avenue. In Boston, police officers went on strike. The mayor of Boston fired the police commissioner but Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, who you see there in the photograph, reinstated him and mobilized the state guard to police the city, and became famous enough as a result of all this that he was nominated by the Republicans for vice president in 1920. And a steelworkers strike shut down steel mills throughout the country. The war is over, but it's like the war has come back home. There's labor unrest. There's all kinds of issues come up, as we'll see in a minute, about rights to free speech and opposition to the war. On October 2nd, just a few days after returning to the White House, President Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke that forced the cancellation of a reception for the visiting King and Queen of Belgium. Admiral Grayson continued to refuse to provide information about the president's condition beyond the initial announcement that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion. Senator George Moses, a Republican senator from New Hampshire, wrote in a letter to a constituent who had asked about the president's condition that he was a very sick man, that the president was a very sick man who is unable to, this is a quote, unable to undergo any experience which requires concentration of mind. When Moses' letter was leaked to the press, Admiral Grayson questioned the senator's medical qualifications and said he must have, quote, must have information that I do not possess. Of course, Senator Moses was closer to being accurate than Admiral Grayson was as far as the public statements were concerned. In the Senate, several amendments to the treaty were defeated, came to a vote and were defeated, including the amendments to limit voting by the British Empire and to delete the provision allowing Japanese occupation of Shantung. Meanwhile, in Paris, French President Poincaré issued a declaration stating that because Great Britain, Italy, and France had ratified the Treaty of Versailles, France's state of war with Germany was at an end. And back in Washington, the Belgian king and queen, before leaving the United States at the end of the month, at the end of October, visited the president briefly in his bedroom at the White House. Labor unrest spread across multiple industries in the U.S. that month. The strike of East Coast longshoremen paralyzed transatlantic and coastwise shipping for a week before it was called off, following an ultimatum from the War Department. The steel industry strike that began in September led to violent confrontations between striking steelworkers, police, and strikebreakers. Martial law was declared in Gary, Indiana, and surrounding steel cities, and Army units under the command of this gentleman, General Leonard Wood, were sent into the city to maintain order. Leonard Wood had been Teddy Roosevelt's commanding officer at the Battle of San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. He was one of the very senior officers of the Army during World War I. He was kind of sidelined, not chosen to lead the troops over to Europe because he was known to be a Republican. He was also a medical doctor, by the way. I don't think that was a disqualification, but that was another thing on his resume. And he was a leading candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1920. Following cabinet meetings presided over by Secretary of the Treasury Carter Glass, a statement was issued in the president's name denouncing a threatened coal strike as calculated to create a disastrous fuel famine. This was at a time when basically coal was the major source of energy and heating, certainly for the country and for most countries. Not to mention ships, transportation, ships and trains. Attorney General Palmer went to court and obtained an injunction forbidding the United Mine Workers from going ahead with the strike. But when the strike deadline arrived at month's end, the miners walked off the job without further direction from the union's national officers who had been the objects of the injunction. Volstead Act, enforcing nationwide prohibition pursuant to the newly adopted 18th Amendment, was returned to Congress with a veto message, objecting that the legislation included provisions no longer appropriate to continue enforcement of wartime prohibition. Congress overrode the veto the next day. The Volstead Act became law. And the big news, the Cincinnati Redlegs unexpectedly defeated the favored Chicago White Sox in the World Series to win the series 5-3. It was the best of 9 series in those days. Not long afterward, the Black Sox scandal surfaced when a grand jury charged that some of the Chicago players had conspired with a gambling syndicate to lose the series intentionally. And there they are. For much of November, the Senate was occupied debating and voting on a series of proposed amendments and reservations to the proposed Treaty of Versailles. A cloture rule adopted after the armed ships bill filibuster in 1917, but applied now for the first time, limited each senator's time to speak, but there was no limit on the number of senators who could have their say. All of the proposed amendments were defeated, as were most of the reservations, other than 14 reservations proposed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that were referred to as the Lodge reservations. The League to Enforce Peace continued to send a mixed message, generally supporting the treaty, but voting down a resolution to oppose the Lodge reservation. So they were sort of on both sides of the issue as far as these reservations were concerned. These are just my shorthand version of each of these 14 reservations. They all, in one way or another, tried to reserve to the U.S. and to Congress the final say on all of these issues. The most important one was the second one there, obligation to defend member nations, Article 10 of the treaty, which required members of the League of Nations to come to the defense of member nations when they were attacked. And so the second reservation there would make it clear that that's not going to happen as far as the U.S. is concerned without congressional action. In sending that mixed message, I guess you could say the League to Enforce Peace, or at least in not opposing the reservations, the League to Enforce Peace followed the lead of two of its most prominent members, former President Taft and Harvard President Lawrence Lowell, who argued that some reservations might be necessary to get the treaty ratified. And of course, this ultimately becomes the real issue on ratification. After 2 meetings with the president, Senator Gilbert Hitchcock of Nebraska, the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, summarized the president's views in a draft letter which he gave to Mrs. Wilson to show the president for his approval. She read it to the president. Remember, he's in bed, basically incapacitated. So she takes it into his bedroom and reads it to him. He makes some changes to it. She revises it as directed and returns it to Senator Hitchcock, who shares it with his fellow Democrats. It's promptly, of course, leaked to the press. And it says that in the president's opinion, quote, the resolution for ratification of the treaty with the reservations does not provide for ratification, but rather for nullification of the treaty. And that he, quote, hope the friends and supporters of the treaty will vote against the Lodge resolution of ratification. So he's saying very clearly that he does not want the treaty if it's going to have these reservations. He'd rather not have a treaty than have it with these reservations. He's showing a stubborn streak that will continue throughout this story. The president's firm rejection led to the treaty's defeat. On November 19th, 3 final votes on consent to the treaty were taken. All 3 failed to pass. The first 2 were the Lodge reservation, since he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. It was the Lodge resolution, I should say, which ratified the treaty, but with these Lodge reservations. They were voted down fairly decisively. A 2/3 vote was required for ratification. They didn't even get a majority vote or a plurality vote. I said there were 3 votes taken. That's because there was a vote, and then there was a vote to reconsider. So it was the motion to reconsider was passed, and then it was reconsidered, but with the same result. So it was voted down twice. The so-called Lodge resolution was voted down twice, and then there was the Democrats prevailed on the Senate to consider what was known as the Underwood resolution, which Democratic Senator Underwood from Alabama introduced a resolution of ratification with no reservations, which of course is what Wilson wanted. So that was brought to a vote also, and that was defeated even more decisively than the other one, than the Lodge resolution. After all 3 of those resolutions had failed to pass, the Senate adjourned. President Wilson declined to make any statement in response to the Senate's action and refused even to see Senator Hitchcock, who was his main spokesman in the Senate. When Senator Hitchcock called at the White House, and Wilson said, no, I don't want to talk to him. I said the Senate adjourned, and this is what it adjourned for the session. It was the end of the session. The new session was scheduled to begin the first Monday in December, as the Constitution in those days required, and it would be the same Congress, but it would be a brand new session. And Hitchcock and the other treaty supporters resolved to bring the treaty before the Senate again in that session in early December. Meanwhile, other things were happening in the U.S. Attorney General Palmer, using authority given by the Espionage Act, ordered raids on the headquarters of the Industrial Workers of the World and the Seattle Union Record, organized labor's newspaper voice in the Pacific Northwest. In another First Amendment challenge to the Espionage and Sedition Acts, these are the legislation that had been passed by Congress during World War I and very much supported by President Wilson, which came down hard on any disloyal action or utterance by anyone who could be prosecuted under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The first one of the first challenges or prosecutions under those acts made it to the Supreme Court in November of 1919. And the court, in a 7-2 ruling, affirmed the conviction of Russian immigrant and anarchist Jacob Abrams and several of his comrades for distributing leaflets condemning President Wilson for sending troops to Russia to fight the Bolsheviks. The lasting impact of the decision was not in the majority ruling, but in the dissenting opinion of Justice Holmes, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, joined by Justice Louis Brandeis, in which he included a ringing affirmation of the bedrock principle of free speech, which is quoted, has been quoted ever since, and is for the last, I would say, since in most cases since World War II, has been treated as if it was the law instead of the dissent. What Holmes said was that the First Amendment is based on belief in the free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. And he insisted that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so eminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law that an immediate check is required to save the country. In Great Britain, Lady Astor became the first woman elected to the House of Commons. Born Nancy Langhorne in Virginia, she was the wife of William Waldorf Astor, a wealthy American who had moved to England, where he became a British subject and a member of the House of Lords. The Prince of Wales visited the United States and Canada, calling on President Wilson in the White House and touring New York City and the Military Academy at West Point. That guy, the Prince of Wales, is the one on the left. The one on the right is the Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, who had just come back from World War I and been sent to West Point as superintendent. And the next week at the Polo Grounds, I have to include the Army-Navy football rivalry resumed after a 2-year hiatus due to the war. And Navy won that game, 6-0.
You had to bring that up.
Yes, I did indeed. I apologize. As was the custom, President Wilson delivered the annual State of the Union message on the first day of the new session of Congress. But wait a minute, he's in bed, so no, he didn't go in person this time. Remember, he was the first president in modern, in over 100 years, to actually deliver the State of the Union message in person. And he sort of set the precedent for every president since then who has tended to do that. But this time, he was obviously in no condition to go to Congress and deliver a State of the Union message or any other message. So he sent the message in writing, and it was read to a joint session of Congress. Despite the importance of the Treaty of Versailles, he did not mention it in his State of the Union message, nor did he mention the controversy over its ratification. This fact, in addition to the president's refusal to see Senator Hitchcock a week earlier, increased concern in Congress about the president's ability to do his to perform the duties of his office. So when an American citizen shortly thereafter was seized in Mexico, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee appointed a subcommittee of two, Senator Hitchcock and Republican Senator Albert Fall, to visit the White House and discuss the matter with the president in person. Some people called it a smelling committee, but it was the idea was this was an excuse for them to go and see for themselves what kind of shape the president was in. After the meeting, both senators judged the president perfectly capable of handling the situation. A conclusion that was perhaps aided by the dim light in the president's bedroom, by the artful arrangement of the bedclothes, and most importantly, by the announcement during the meeting that the American citizen had been released. So this turned out not to be the big reveal that it might have been. Back in the Senate, efforts to reach an accommodation regarding acceptable reservations continued until mid-December, when the White House issued a statement that seemed to foreclose once and for all any hope that the president might be willing to compromise. The statement said that the hope of the Republican leaders in the Senate that the president would presently make some move which will relieve the situation with regard to the treaty is entirely without foundation, and insisted that the president has, again, this is in the written statement that was issued, insisted that the president had no compromise or concession of any kind in mind, but intends that the Republican leaders of the Senate shall continue to bear the undivided responsibility for the fate of the treaty and the present condition of the world in consequence of that fate. Still hoping to find an acceptable formula, Senator Hitchcock said he agreed with the president that concession or compromises for the Senate, not the president, and that the Senate supporters of the treaty will continue to seek a compromise between the Lodge reservations and those I offered last November, close quote. Senator Lodge, the Republican leader, blocked a proposal by Senator Underwood, the Alabama Democrat, to establish a conciliation committee of 10 senators to reach a compromise. At the end of the month being December of 1919, Joseph Tumulty, the president's secretary, met separately with the president and Senator Hitchcock, leading to some hope, or at least speculation, that the new year might see the president become more involved in the ratification debate. On the day before Christmas, the White House announced that the nation's railroads, which had been nationalized during the war, would be returned to private ownership on March 1st. A Christmas Day parade on Fifth Avenue in support of amnesty for political prisoners was broken up by the police. General Leonard Wood gave permission for his name to be entered in the South Dakota Republican presidential primary. Viscount French, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and former commander of the British Expeditionary Force in France, escaped an assassination attempt by members of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, as he was being driven through Phoenix Park in Dublin on his way to the Viceregal Lodge. You may recall that he was the original commander of the British forces in Europe during the war. One of the attackers was shot dead, 2 policemen were injured. In Paris, Premier Clemenceau won a strong vote of confidence after a speech outlining France's foreign policy. He expressed his satisfaction with the military guarantees from Great Britain and the United States. He predicted a solution to the disagreement with Italy about Fiume, and he declared France's firm opposition to the Soviet government in Russia, promising that, quote, "we will be the allies of all people attacked by Bolshevism." In the new year, raids rounding up suspected anarchists and communists, begun in 1919 by Attorney General Palmer, continued under the supervision of J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the General Intelligence Division of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation. And of course, he later becomes the first director and longtime director of the FBI. A letter from President Wilson stating his views on treaty ratification was read to the Democratic Party's annual Jackson Day dinner, which was held on January 8th at 2 adjacent hotels, the Willard and the Washington. This is the Willard, the Washington is right over here next to it. And they're both still there. Or go to Washington, we'll look at them. The Washington Hotel is now the W Hotel for some reason. It was a big enough dinner that they needed 2 hotels to accommodate it. They were held simultaneously. There were 2 speakers who traded off. One was William Jennings Bryan, and he alternated with Champ Clark, the former Speaker of the House, in speaking to the Jackson Day dinners. In his letter, President Wilson repeated his insistence that the treaty must be accepted without substantive reservations. And he said that if the Senate rejected the treaty, the next election would be a, quote, great and solemn referendum. But he did agree in his letter that there would be no reasonable objection to interpretations accompanying the act of ratification, provided they do not form a part of the formal ratification itself. Not quite sure what that means. And nobody else was either, so that helped. Former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who alternated with former Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, addressed both dinners, urging acceptance of any concessions necessary to achieve ratification. He thought ratification was the important. A series after the dinner, after the Jackson Day dinner, a series of bipartisan meetings began on January 15th and ended on January 30th, when with Republicans refusing to agree to any weakening of the Lodge reservations, including one proposed by former President Taft that would have amended the reservation to Article 10, the second reservation we talked about regarding American obligation to come to the defense of any League member who was attacked. On January 31st, Viscount Grey, the former foreign minister of Great Britain, returned to the UK after a brief posting to the US as ambassador. He had come over to try to work something out about the Treaty of Versailles. And while in the US, he had met with Secretary Lansing, Senator Lodge, and others involved in the ratification debate, but his attempts to meet with President Wilson were unsuccessful. Wilson refused to see him, partly probably because Wilson had made up his mind that he was not interested in even discussing the possibility of reservations, but also possibly because word had gotten back to Wilson, undoubtedly, that one of the people on Viscount Grey's staff that had made some unflattering comments about Mrs. Wilson. I don't know if unflattering is the word. I think what had been reported was that this member of Grey's staff had told a joke that what did Mrs. Wilson say when Woodrow Wilson asked her to marry him? She was so surprised she fell out of bed. Now, that was the story that was going around, was that somebody had told that story. Anyway, that may have been part of the reason why Wilson refused to see Grey. When Grey got back to London, he wrote a long letter to the London Times, which was also published in the United States, in which he stated that Britain would accept reservations necessary to achieve American participation in the League, and urged the other allies to do the same. So Grey joined the voices of former President Taft, the League to Enforce Peace, and many others in saying that the League of Nations is important enough, and the Treaty of Versailles is important enough that we really should accept whatever reservations the U.S. thinks are necessary. On January 10th, in a simple ceremony at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Allies deposited their certificates of ratification and signed documents declaring the war with Germany at an end. The United States was not represented. The Executive Council of the League of Nations held its first meeting on January 16th. Also on January 16th, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution became effective, making prohibition the law of the land. On January 17th, after failing to receive his party's endorsement for president, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau resigned his post. He was succeeded by Alexandre Millerand. Paul Deschanel was elected president. On January 23rd, the Netherlands formally refused the Allies' request to extradite the Kaiser. When President Wilson saw Viscount Grey's letter urging the Allies to accept the reservations as the price of ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, he reacted angrily, regarding it as foreign interference in domestic politics. On February 5th, 1920, he issued a statement that if Gray were still the ambassador, his government would have been promptly asked to withdraw. Secretary of State Lansing made no public statement, but it was well known that he welcomed Gray's letter as a step toward favorable action in the Senate. Again, this is Lansing was not in good graces with Wilson to begin with, and this was a nail in the coffin. So on February 7th, Wilson sent Lansing a harsh letter demanding to know whether it was true that he had convened the cabinet without Wilson's knowledge during his incapacity. Lansing replied on February 13th, saying he had called informal meetings of the cabinet in an effort to keep the government running as smoothly as possible, but offered to resign, quote, if you think I have failed in my loyalty to you, close quote. Wilson promptly accepted Lansing's resignation, and on February 25th, appointed Bainbridge Colby, a man with no background in diplomacy and no apparent qualifications for the job, to succeed Lansing as Secretary of State. So the Senate still has the option, the opportunity to consider the Treaty of Versailles, what to do with it, one last chance. And on February 10th, the Senate voted to reconsider the Treaty of Versailles with the Lodge reservations. President Wilson let it be known that he opposed ratification under those conditions. And on March 19th, the Senate failed again to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. This time with the Lodge reservations. And this time it was because many of the Democrats in the Senate followed Wilson's direction and voted against ratification. The vote was 49 in favor of ratification and 35 opposed. So for the first time, there was an actual majority in favor of ratification, but it was far short of the, well, far short. It was 7 votes short of the necessary 2/3. The 49 in favor were 28 Republicans and 21 Democrats favored ratification with the Lodge reservations. The 35 opposed were 23 Democrats and 12 Republicans. The 12 Republicans included many of those 12 Republicans were among the irreconcilables. They were going to vote against the treaty no matter what. So there we are. The cartoon says it all. This bridge was designed by the President of the USA. And here's the Keystone, USA, and here's Uncle Sam refusing to insert it. That's it.